Today is April 11th, 2008. 40 years ago this month, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. I'm Candace Presley, and we are once again here at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. 1 week ago, we made history as we reinvigorated the work of Dr. King and his Worldhouse by globally connecting the people and places of China, India, Kenya, and South Africa with neighbors in Florida and here in Georgia. Although physically separated by oceans, miles, and multiple time zones, we here in North America tapped our feet to the same beat as our brothers and sisters in Asia and Africa. Collectively, we unleashed the power Dr. King spoke and wrote about to lead a revolution of values and ideas, not just here in America, but around the globe. Today, we're back in the Worldhouse, and over the next 60 minutes, we're going to address the 3 ongoing issues that threaten to bring down the Worldhouse. To help us get there, consider this analogy. If a human-made house is infested by termites, carpet ants, and dry rot, what's going to happen? Its structure will collapse in absolutely no time. The elements that threaten Dr. King's Worldhouse are just as destructive. Racism, poverty, and militarism are the key barriers to building his beloved community, the Worldhouse. Today, we are boldly stepping over those barriers, connecting, once again, a living Worldhouse. It's morning here in Atlanta, Georgia at Dr. King's alma mater, Morehouse College. And at the same time, it's an even earlier morning at Stanford University, the home of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. And at the same time, it's late afternoon in Johannesburg, South Africa, where Nelson Mandela persevered so long to topple apartheid. In a few minutes, we will meet and interact live with our partners from around the world. But first, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Walter Fluker. He's the interim director of the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. collection at Morehouse. Dr. Fluker.
Thank you, Candace. We're so delighted to have you again serve as our moderator for this great event. And thanks to all of you who are once again choosing to help us make the Worldhouse more than a metaphor of our global interconnectedness, but a concrete manifestation of our common human struggle. Allow me to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Hewlett-Packard and IACOM, for their support of this event, and to our partners at the University of Florida and the Digital Worlds Institute. We thank you for uniting with us for this worldwide webcast. On behalf of our president, Dr. Robert Michael Franklin, the 10th president of Morehouse College, our board of trustees, we are indeed grateful for you to join us. Part of President Franklin's strategic vision is that Morehouse College will serve as a global resource for educated and ethical leaders, what he calls Renaissance men with a social conscience. This means, in the context of this World Wide Web, that we dare to begin a conversation, a global conversation, about the living legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., which embraces his prophetic vision of the Worldhouse. 40 years ago, at the Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee, a wearied and frustrated Martin Luther King Jr. addressed a capacity crowd on the eve of his assassination. Despite storm warnings, these people had come to hear him speak, and he, despite other warnings of death, had come to bear witness to his dream. Listen to his quote. "I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. And I see God working in this period of the 20th century in a way that men, and I would add women, in some strange way are responding. Something is happening in our world. The masses of the people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or in Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same. We want to be free. So with wearied brow and a premonition of death surrounding him, in his last public sentences, he, like the prophets and seers of old, spoke of a vision as old as human strivings, but it is always coming to us from the future. He says, well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He has allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And he closes, and I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. When Martin Luther King Jr. made these final statements, he was speaking out of an experience and a vision which had enraptured him since his early days in Montgomery. But it became full-blown by 1964 when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. In his Nobel Peace Prize lecture, which is part of the Martin Luther King Jr. collection here at Morehouse College, he spoke decisively to what he called the three pillars of oppression: race, poverty, and war. Today's conversation is really about these triplets of oppression. How might we, in a post-King era, begin to interrogate some of the assumptions of race, poverty, and war? As our nation feverishly negotiates with North Korea, struggles with a crisis between Israel and Palestine, and out of the corner of another eye are watching India and China on the rise. What does it mean to rethink and to feel deeply Dr. King's vision of the Worldhouse and the challenges of globalization as they relate to these key issues of race, poverty, and war? Least being the struggle that we have now in Iraq. I encourage you today, therefore, to join us. Help us to think through these issues, because this is part of an ongoing conversation that we hope at Morehouse College will continue through our blogging. That address is www.morehouse.edu. We want you to be in touch with us, and we want to hear from you. I'll be back in a minute as soon as Candace introduces our other partners. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Fluker. This is indeed an opportunity for our global partners to experience the King Collection. Partnering with us from our neighboring state are students, faculty, and staff at the University of Florida Digital Worlds Institute. Let's say good morning to the Florida Gators. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
And moving a few states to the north, we want to welcome our partners from Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. Say good morning to the Blue Devils. How are you all today? Still waking up, maybe, perhaps. Good morning. And from the East Coast to the West Coast, let's go to Stanford University in California, where the sun is just rising. Hello.
Hi, good to be with you.
Thank you very much. We're happy to have you with us as well. Here is to another global connection, as we have successfully joined people from around the world over the internet. Now, everybody, prepare to roll up your sleeves, let us be clear about our focus today. We are here to engage Dr. King's work in such a way that by the time this global webcast has concluded, we will have built on the foundation that will allow us to emerge from our struggles with racism, poverty, and militarism. As Dr. King said, there is no way to peace. Peace is the way. And everyone, welcome to the Worldhouse. Now here in Atlanta, we want to take another moment just to say thank you again to our sponsors, IOCOM and Hewlett-Packard, for helping to make all of this possible. Now earlier this year at Morehouse, the entire student body was issued a challenge. Write an essay that critically examines character, civility, and community based on Dr. King's works. There were 3 essays that really stood out, each one reflecting in its own way the same sense of urgency that was echoed in Dr. King's writings. Join me now as we welcome our first place winner, Eric Vickers, to the stage.
Good morning, Worldhouse. In the development of leadership, Dr. King understood that community was vital. In the final chapter of Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, the Worldhouse articulated King's indictment of racism, poverty, and war on a global level. Dr. King expressed that although mankind made significant medicinal and technological advances, she lacks morality and spirituality. As tenants of the Worldhouse, humanity pays rent to one another through character, civility, and community. However, reality reminds society that the Worldhouse was not erected on Idealist Lane and Utopian Boulevard. Therefore, problems such as racism exist in the neighborhood. Dr. King referred to the story of Moses demanding to Pharaoh to let my people go. He emphasized that the story of oppression continues. Nonetheless, the urge and demand for freedom rings louder than ever before. Although history is removed from the era of the civil rights movement, racism in its various forms is still alive. Dr. King cautioned the world with a prophetic phrase that resounds as a lasting caveat. Together we must learn to live as brothers, or together we will be forced to perish as fools. Racism does not build, it destroys. Racism does not edify, it knocks down. Racism does not uplift, it beats down. Racism does not open doors, it seeks to keep them closed. Secondly, the Worldhouse must be concerned with the problems of poverty. King mentioned that with the wealth of countries in the world, poverty should be absent. The world is familiar with poverty. The impoverished have existed as long as the rich. The existence of poverty cannot be excused because the Worldhouse has the resources for elimination. King said the first step in the worldwide war against poverty is commitment. If commitment is extinct within the community, society has no hope to resolve poverty. Finally, the Worldhouse must concern itself with what realists claim to be unavoidable and necessary: war. The last issue Dr. King addressed was the issue of war. The Worldhouse has an option between chaos and community. King cited President Kennedy as saying, "Mankind must put an end to war, or war will put an end to mankind." The 20th century stance of Kennedy and King has 21st century relevance. Dr. King campaigned for nonviolence and said, "We must concentrate not merely on the eradication of war, but on the affirmation of peace." No greater strategy could be conjured to terminate the unjust occurrences in the Middle East and around the world. If tenants of the Worldhouse refuse to exterminate the issues of racism, poverty, and war that plague society's abode, the infestation will cause the foundation of the Worldhouse to crumble. America needed a nonviolent extremist to drench the fire of inequality. America needed a bold drum major for justice to lead the march toward equality. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. understood that character was essential to the development of leadership. However, King also understood that character is comprised of civility and sense of community. He understood their individual significance as well as their interrelatedness. Just as one cannot experience a complete life without the three components of length, width, and height, Dr. King also understood that character, civility, and community are central to ethical leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. No wonder I could never find that house on Utopian Boulevard. Now I know to stop looking. We know that you consider yourself, sir, to be a lifelong student of Dr. King. And yet there is somewhat of an ironic twist to your story. Why don't you share that with everyone?
Well, the twist is, I never knew anything about the Worldhouse. And as a lifelong student, when I stumbled upon the Worldhouse, I felt ashamed and I felt embarrassed. But then I thought to myself and I realized that if I was unaware of the Worldhouse, chances are many others are also unaware. And I believe that can be attributed to the Worldhouse living in the shadow of the I Have a Dream speech and the Mountaintop speech. But I encourage everyone to research and read the Worldhouse in the final chapter of Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community.
Eric, thank you very much, and congratulations on your winning essay. Everyone, let's give Eric another hand of applause. We will hear from our other two essay winners over the next couple of weeks. Despite our strides, division and separation continue to permeate our world. Today, the man who served as ambassador to South Africa when Nelson Mandela was freed believes there is much the United States can learn about race and reconciliation from South Africa. Ambassador Jim Joseph joins us now from Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, where he is professor of the practice of public policy studies. He also works to help emerging leaders in Southern Africa through a joint appointment at Duke and the University of Cape Town. Ambassador Joseph, tell us more about your beliefs regarding race and reconciliation.
Thank you very much. Let me first congratulate Dr. Fluker and the Leadership Center at Morehouse for reminding us of the many ways in which the insights of Dr. King can help us 40 years later to cope with the challenges of an interdependent world. A world that is integrating and fragmenting at the same time. Over the last 12 years, I've divided my time between the United States and South Africa. So my perspective on racism, poverty, and the use of state power has a binational dimension. And it is against the backdrop of that experience that I want to offer three observations for our conversation about what Dr. King called the Worldhouse. The first observation: long before the language of soft power became a part of our public discourse, Dr. King understood that while hard power can be used to inflict or to prevent pain, it is soft power that is likely to develop influence and create change that can endure. I worked closely with Nelson Mandela during my years as the United States ambassador, and he demonstrated that seduction is more powerful than coercion. Heads of state from around the world beat a path to his door and sought his advice on the issues of the day because his influence came not from the power of the South African military, but from the elegance of his humanity, the strength of his ideals, the power of his personality, and the loftiness of his values. He often said that if we did not learn how to solve problems in the world through our brains, we would ultimately have to solve them through our blood. Nelson Mandela contradicted the notion that the most effective leader is the one who can bluff, bully, or buy his way into influence. He remains the prototype of smart power, knowing when it is best to use hard power and when it is best to use soft power. My second observation: we cannot hope to address poverty in any meaningful or enduring way without addressing race-based barriers and biases. Many people in South Africa and the United States would like to believe that race is no longer a factor in poverty, and that the continued use of race in the public discourse impedes rather than facilitates progress. My first visit to South Africa was in 1973 as an anti-apartheid activist, and I got into serious trouble with the government by calling apartheid a pigmentocracy in which resources were apportioned in accordance with the pigmentation of the skin. That pigmentocracy has now been established, but like the United States, 40 years after Dr. King, a strong pigmentology remains. Early efforts to make the poor invisible in South Africa by isolating them in townships, and in the United States by a form of psychological exile, have now given way to demonizing the poor. Some of us will remember how the image of the welfare queen was once used to undermine support for policy solutions. There is now a new mental image that regularly depicts the poor as a dysfunctional threat to public order and undeserving of public support. And of course, they are almost always depicted as people of color. Researchers have recently found that while blacks represent 29% of poor Americans, nearly 70% of the poor shown on television news are black. The portrait has interacted with social biases to erode support for an anti-poverty program that could reach all of the poor who were the concern of Dr. King. My third and final observation is this: while I would be the first to argue that the problems of race and poverty cannot be solved by government alone, I am still persuaded that ending poverty will require change in the way we conduct the public business of a democracy. Some key American leaders advocate addressing poverty primarily through private benevolence. This strikes a chord with some of our citizens who've been led to believe that government is neither capable nor can it be trusted to secure the common good, and that even if it could, there is not a national will to reduce poverty. This distrust of government, often fed ironically by those who lead government, flies in the face of American history. We cannot afford to forget that it was government that helped create wealth and opportunity for many who now insist that poverty should be addressed primarily through self-help and private compassion. In many instances, it was government subsidy that gave the white middle class their head start and continued to ensure that they had not only income to help them get along, but assets to help them get ahead. This history includes the 19th century Homestead Act, Federal Housing Administration loans, the GI Bill, land and water subsidies in the West, and the later use of the tax codes to subsidize home ownership, property, and wealth. Many of these beneficiaries of government welfare call these benefits subsidies, while they reject subsidies for the poor by despairingly calling them welfare. The only way then to develop a national will and to end poverty is to develop allies in the middle class who must be made to understand the many ways in which they too are just a few paychecks away from poverty. Economists are now reminding us that there has not been a time since the Great Depression when the American middle class had more economic vulnerabilities in common with the poor. Developing a national will to end poverty may also remind and require us that we remind those concerned about spreading democracy that the best way to demonstrate the efficacy of American democracy abroad is to demonstrate that it can work equitably for all of our citizens at home. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Joseph. I'm sure it would be quite a chilling statistic if we were to learn how many middle-class Americans indeed are one or two paychecks away from poverty. Dr. King said there is nothing new about poverty. What is new is that we now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. The real question, he wrote, is whether we have the will. Dr. Clay Carson has devoted a large part of his professional life to the study of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He is professor of history at Stanford University and the founding director of the Martin Luther King, Jr. Research and Education Institute. Dr. Carson, we thank you so much for getting up so early to be with us. But the good news for everyone is that you had an extremely short commute. Am I correct?
That's right. I'm sitting here in my home, and it's really great to be with you. I want to join Ambassador Joseph in congratulating Walter Fluker for bringing all of this together, and all of you who are part of this discussion. And I think that this has particular meaning for me because in the last week, a week ago, I was at Riverside Church, where Martin Luther King gave his Riverside speech against the war in Vietnam, and we brought together some of the people who were part of that event and reflected on its importance 40 years later. And then I went to Memphis, where he gave his mountaintop speech, and there again, Tavis Smiley was able to bring together many of the participants and the sanitation workers strike and many of the people who came in to work with Martin Luther King in Memphis at the end of his life. So all of this has kind of reinforced the importance of what Martin Luther King was trying to do at the end of his life. And I think that that's particularly important because during the King holiday period, we tend to focus as Americans on the I Have a Dream speech and overlook the last 4 years of his life, when I think he was, in some respects, doing his most important work, and certainly the work that has remained unfinished. Ambassador Joseph has already given some indications of the kinds of things I would like to have said about poverty, and I certainly agree with all of his very insightful remarks. But I'd like to center my remarks around one aspect of King that I don't think is well understood. Among the many intriguing findings of the sixth volume of the Papers of Martin Luther King was that King's commitment to social change was forged far earlier than his decision to accept the unexpected call to become the spokesman for the Montgomery bus boycott in December 1955. That is, before he was a civil rights leader, he was something else. And the first document of that volume is an academic paper entitled The Preaching Ministry that he submitted as a 19-year-old first-year seminary student at Crozier Theological Seminary. He had just arrived from Morehouse, and in that paper he confidently announced that he, like other ministers of the social gospel, should have a dual mission, that of changing the souls of individuals and changing society so that the individual soul would have a chance. He concluded that he must be concerned about, and he listed these things: unemployment, slums, and economic insecurity. Now, I think it's revealing that this list did not include civil rights. Yet, King's 1948 paper provides a cogent description of his mission 2 decades later when he launched the Poor People's Campaign and made that fateful decision to travel to Memphis in support of the strike of sanitation workers. So my point is that when viewed from the perspective of his life, his principal identity was as a social gospel minister. But King's life made a detour in 1955 as the unexpected consequence of Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. Most Americans came to know Martin Luther King as a civil rights leader, and he did in fact become the leading symbol of the historical movement to bring about the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But we need to understand that he did not retire then and announce victory. Once these historic reforms were achieved, he resumed his basic identity as a social gospel minister pursuing more far-reaching social change. Within days of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, he was in Los Angeles formulating a response to the massive outbreak of racial violence that was known as the Watts Riot. By 1966, he and his family were living in Chicago slums in order to combat the endemic problems of the urban poor. The following year, he conceived of the Poor People's Campaign, intended to bring the problem of poverty to the attention of the nation's political leaders. And by that time, he understood that there was a global gulf between rich and poor. But I think in saying this, it's important to realize that he understood by the end of his life that perhaps he had been overly optimistic about the prospects for closing that gulf. Although King saw the campaign for economic justice as a natural extension of his campaign for civil rights, many of the allies who had supported his civil rights campaign were far less enthusiastic about his campaign for global human rights. There was a widespread white backlash in the North as well as the South against black militancy, and this severely weakened the liberal Democratic coalition that had supported civil rights reform. So one fact that I think that we need to understand is that Lyndon Johnson's landslide victory in the 1964 presidential election was followed during the next decade by the defection of tens of millions of white voters from the Democratic Party to the Republicans. And that election was the last election in which a majority of white voters and a majority of black voters supported the same candidate. So this racial divide in American politics complicates the effort to close the economic divide that separates the poor from the rest of us in the United States and elsewhere in the world. So I think that we need to be realistic about where we are today in completing Martin Luther King's campaign. It's interesting that in 1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, ending poverty was the national policy of the United States. In the current presidential campaign, it is not the high priority issue. Perhaps with one of the candidates, John Edwards, that might have been the case, but I think that most of us have moved on, and that's true for black Americans as well as white Americans. Even at the time of King's death, his Poor People's Campaign did not attract as much attention or support from black Americans as did the drive for greater racial consciousness, the Black Power movement, and other things that were going on that had far more support among black Americans than did his campaign against poverty. Now, I'm simply saying this not to discourage people, but to say that we need to understand how far we have gone from Martin Luther King's vision of a global war, not only against war itself, but also to deal with the global problem of poverty. So I think that if he were here today, what he would advise us is that we have come a long way in terms of civil rights reform. The nation is far from the nation that we were then. But on the other hand, with respect to the issues that he felt most dearly about, both in 1948 and 1968, I think that we are farther away today than we were at the time of his death. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Dr. Carson. You're right, we have gone a very long way, but indeed have so much farther to go. The last of the three evils that Dr. King wrote about is militarism. Back here on the East Coast, we are joined by University of Florida professor and political anthropologist Dr. Faye Harrison. Dr. Harrison, you talk about the damaging effects of violence, specifically in the form of militarism that emanates from states and insurgencies around the globe. Can you tell us more?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, part of this ultimately international conversation about a very important metaphor and what it means in very concrete terms. Morehouse College should be commended for bringing us all together to commemorate an aspect of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's prophetic theology and philosophy of redemption that's less known than the much more popularized and politically appropriated ideas expressed in his famous I Have a Dream speech. In King's provocative use of the Worldhouse metaphor, he shifts our focus from the dream of a non-racist democratic society to the harsh reality, sometimes of nightmarish proportions, of a world fraught with severe inequalities, injustices, and conflict. He explains this worldly reality in terms of the giant triplets of racial injustice, poverty, and militarism, symbiotic and mutually reinforcing, triple evils that must be eradicated before the diverse human family can live together in a world house where unifying principles of justice, peace, and love can prevail. For this envisioned outcome to be achieved, we as human beings must first find ways to work cooperatively toward a revolution of values, ideas, and concrete intergroup and international practices that enable us to see ourselves and our extended kin in others, despite differences of color, culture, language, religion, class, and political ideology. King adamantly believed that such a global community of shared common ground can be achieved. Indeed, must be built to save us as human beings from utter self-destruction. As he put it, our choice is either community or chaos. Either we choose to work together toward creating a world that affirms the sanctity of human life with its wonderful possibilities for converting scientific and technological innovation and genius into more sustainable and ethically responsible forms of human and ecological well-being, or we resign ourselves to merely existing in a world in which violent, dehumanizing, and life-denying conditions pull the human family apart, pushing us toward the precipice of possible species and planetary extinction. We as a contradictory culture-building and culture-destroying species have the technological know-how, the economic nearsighted lust for profit, and the expansionist geopolitical and military capacity to demolish our own world. We have the capacity to create weapons of mass destruction or the tools for affirming and concretely demonstrating a powerfully humane spirit. From the windows of King's imagined Worldhouse, he described three-dimensional scenarios of nightmarish intensity produced by the evil triplets that unleash their destructive power through structured mechanisms that link socially manufactured inequalities and politically orchestrated wars on the international terrain to local level microaggressions that render interpersonal relationships dysfunctional in families and households, schools, workplaces, and communities. The militarism exhibited between nation-states or between states and intra-state insurgencies and the intimate violence played out in some contexts of domestic conflict are both manifestations of what peace researchers characterize as structural violence, defined as the symbolic, psychological, and physical assaults against human consciousness, bodies, and social-cultural integrity that are ultimately derived from situations and institutions that are structured in social, political, and economic dominance. Structural violence, as it exists and operates in today's world, engenders a macro logic and pathology of power that almost guarantees the abuse of human dignity and human rights on an unprecedented scale. Today's rapidly globalizing world, particularly under conditions of neoliberalism, is facing widening disparities in wealth, health, life expectancy, and the exercise of militarized power. The risks of self-destruction are more severe today than they were more than 40 years ago when Dr. King's prophetic wisdom alerted us to the dangers of the giant triplets, which are accompanied by overinvestment, emotional and economic, in materialism and the accumulation of things that appear to be so necessary in our everyday lives. Those lives have been socially and culturally conditioned by the misleading and disempowering logic of capital and commodity, along with their related hierarchies of value, nations, and peoples. That logic is not natural or automatic. It is human-made, and therefore it can be unmade and replaced by a redemptive alternative. In view of the troubles that we face in today's world, from the catastrophic consequences of global warming, which are humanly induced, and pandemics such as HIV/AIDS, to empire-building military operations or occupations, and the assaults and social suffering from free market deregulation. In view of all these troubles, we need to revisit Dr. King's prophetic teachings and embrace the challenge of building a world house. The lives and destiny of future generations desperately depend on the shelter, hospitality, inspiration, and love a world house can provide.
Indeed. Dr. Harrison, thank you very much. All of our speakers have done a marvelous job dissecting the three evils of racism, poverty, and militarism. And I know that our global audience is chomping at the bit to speak and respond to what has been shared, and that opportunity is coming up. But before we get there, Sharon Burney is going to join us now, also from the University of Florida, to round out our discussion through the art of the spoken word. Her piece is entitled, I Am Not a Spoken Word Artist. Sharon Burney, take it away.
Thank you. I am not a spoken word artist, nor am I a poet. I am a vehicle for expression for a people left despondent. My canvas, the world in its abundance, producing a masterpiece for the forgotten. My tools, the beloved pen and paper, antonyms and synonyms, serving at the behest of the divine, painting disturbing images of the disenfranchised, to conceptualize for the blind, eradicate ignorance from the mind, emphasize illumination of the ties that bind, substantiate a palette for those without taste, crafting vocalization with symbolic tones. I am the vestibule for whimpers and moans, hallelujahs and saxophones, triumph and tragedy. Painting metaphorically is my honored responsibility. I am neither Republican nor am I Democrat. I am the dawn of a new day, the questioning of the distortion of facts, the enigma of Iraqi civilian casualties, preponderance of ironic symmetry, preponderance in Agent Orange physical deformities, nations in depleted misery, aborted destinies, mental instability. Oh, my country, 'tis of thee, why does she forsake thee? The fervor of resistance against the annihilation of peace, the conscientious defector, the educational outreach. I am neither patriarch nor anarchist. I am the future of global divide, the resilient determination glaring in the eye, a product of the Most High, the story that remains untold, the optimistic transformation onto Jericho Road. I am not a slave. I am the station of hypocrisy. I am the presiding surveyor of oppressive opportunity, the direct descendant of senseless police brutality, the journalist definition of survival versus looting, institutionally protected shootings, barbaric lynches contrived from fictitious intentions, hurricane victims drowning in post-traumatic stress disorders, imperialistically implanted, non-existent threats to our nation's borders. I am the total reflection of your skin. Am I to pretend to not see the similarities? I am neither feast nor famine, just a citizen left to meticulously examine the manifestation of trickle-down economics, the social destitute impersonating with a fake movado, the worshiping of false bravado, blood diamonds, adorning placated role models, the absence of spiritual multitudes utterly devoid of intellectual fortitude, misguided culmination of historical greed, consecrated perpetuation of self-prescribed pedigree, idly observing the plight of communities, elderly deciphering cryptic budget calculations while standing at the pharmacy, a victim of our own vices, complaining incessantly of high prices, the procreation of global war literacy, unaware of consequential pillaging of trees, continuously pumping gas into SUVs. I am neither environmentalist nor extremist. I am the cessation of gluttonous consumption, the resilience of those who refuse to be deceived, the quality of life for babies yet to be conceived. I am the child of God whom blesses from a clear blue sky. I am the volunteer that sounds the alarming cry.
Sharon, thank you very, very much. We are beginning to run short on time, but we are back here in Atlanta, and welcome back Dr. Walter Fluker with some final thoughts.
Thank you, Candace, and these will be very, very final and brief thoughts. One is, let's give a shout out to Candace Presley for being an incredible moderator. Secondly, I'd like to thank the professors Harrison, Carson, and Joseph, along with Ms. Burney and Mr. Vickers for their contributions today. Thank you very much. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our team here at Morehouse, at the University of Florida, and the University of Florida Digital Worlds Institute. We are so grateful for everybody lifting the load. Let me be very brief, because this conversation continues, not just next week and the following Friday, but our hope is that it will continue throughout cyberspace. We are globally connected. One of the great gifts of Martin King to us and the idea of the Worldhouse is that we are never, ever alone. We are caught in a single garment of destiny, he often said, so that what happens in South Africa or in Kenya or in Beijing or on the south side of Chicago or in the slums of Atlanta or in Watts in LA we're all impacted. Injustice anywhere is against justice everywhere. We want to be a part of an ongoing dynamic conversation, and I'd like to yield the short time that we have left so that we might begin that conversation. Thank you, Ms. Presley.
Absolutely, Dr. Fluker. And then this is about conversation. We want to go to our partners here in the auditorium at Morehouse and also in the auditorium at Florida. We've got time for about 2 questions during the webcast, and then, of course, the conversation is going to continue following the conclusion of the webcast. Is there a question here in the Atlanta audience? Is someone here who has a question and would like to come to the microphone now? Please, come to the microphone. Pose your question right away.
All right. Good morning. My name is Dexter Levine. I'm a senior history major here at Morehouse. Before I pose my question, I was just looking over today's New York Times. 2 of the 3 front page news stories involve welfare and the poverty issue and militarism, and I'm sure there's something in here that addresses the issue of race. So that's just something to think about. But my question, specific to the poverty issue, is going back to this story in the New York Times, is addressed to Ambassador Joseph. Like, you discussed race and poverty and how the government, many believe that the government can't go at it alone. But if, in the case of this in the 96 welfare decision, in which President Clinton went across party lines in order to strike a deal on welfare, many people don't see this as having been productive and having brought people together. How do we go about bringing people together through means of government, and not having to go outside of government, outside to these benevolent few, or the so-called benevolent few?
Ambassador Joseph, in answer to that question about the challenges between government-supported programs and private sector-supported programs.
Thank you very much. I spent 14 years as president of the Council on Foundations, and my responsibility in leading the 2,000 foundation members was to try to get them involved in the social issues and social needs of the day. So I am a fan and an enthusiastic supporter of what private benevolence can do, but the point I am making is that neither sector, whether it's business, government, or civil society, can effectively address the poverty issue alone. What we need is collaboration between all 3 sectors. And in order to do that, in order to get that, we have to convince Americans that it is in our collective self-interest to reduce poverty. We can't make the case on the basis of a moral imperative or even a civic imperative. We've got to do it on the basis of self-interest. That is the only way I think we can create the national will that's necessary to get government to live up to its responsibilities in seeking to form a more perfect union.
Thank you very much. We have time for 1 question left, 1 question at the University of Florida. Do I have a question?
Good morning. I wanted to ask about where the United Nations as a global governing body stands on this issue. Where do they come in with issues of poverty and helping us as a global community build the Worldhouse?
Ambassador Joseph, I think that question is directed for you in the role of the United Nations.
Well, I didn't want to respond to both questions, but if none of my colleagues want to respond, I will. All right, the thing I would say about the United Nations is that it doesn't have significant resources to address poverty issues, and it has to depend on its members, and its members want to do that primarily through their own resources and vehicles. And so the United Nations is not a very effective multilateral agency for addressing poverty. I think, though, it can use its bully pulpit to remind the world of the devastation of poverty and the threat of poverty to the well-being of everyone around the world. And that's the role that the United Nations can play.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We could certainly continue with questions and answers for a great long time, and we will continue to do so over the next 2 Fridays in April. But as we begin to wrap up today's presentation, we do want to go back and say thank you to our partner on the West Coast for getting up so early this morning. Thank you, Dr. Carson.
Thank you for having me.
And to our neighbors at Duke University, yes, applause is appropriate. To our neighbors at Duke University in North Carolina, we want to say thank you again for joining us this morning.
Nice to be with you.
And of course, to our partners at the University of Florida Digital Worlds Institute, thank you for your continued support and solidarity as we virtually build Dr. King's Worldhouse. Thank you very much. And finally, to all of the speakers, the students, the audience members here at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, we want to say thank you for coming back to your place at the table in Dr. King's Worldhouse. We invite you to join us again 1 week from today as we make history yet again with another global webcast. Next Friday, we will go back and visit with our friends in India and Kenya, and on the 25th, our youth are going to rock the house at the Worldhouse, as we've decided to say. And speaking of the students, we invite you to stick around and step up and take over the cameras and the microphones, for this is the part of our program where you get to continue the discussion amongst yourselves. After all, this is your generation, your world, and your time. So come on up and get down with the Worldhouse. I'm Candace Presley. We'll see you next week as the Worldhouse at Morehouse continues.